The Oracle Network. Look deeper.
We have an active shooter. We have an active shooter inside the warehouse.
Welcome to Active Shooter, a podcast that covers the whys, the hows, and the aftermath of active shooter and mass casualty events.
They have an active shooter in the building. A second call says they are being attacked.
I've been shot. 1692 means we got shots fired. 4:15 at Route 291. Sounded like an automatic firearm.
Active shooter, reports of an active shooter,
mass casualty incidents.
Thank you for listening.
You are listening to Active Shooter, a podcast that may contain adult themes, explicit language, and graphic depictions of violence. Portions of this show may be traumatic for those under 18. Listener discretion is advised.
Breaking news out of Lafayette, Louisiana, 135 miles outside of New Orleans, where just hours ago, a man stood up in a crowded movie theater and opened fire. There are fatalities, including the gunman. And we get the latest right now from ABC's Rena Nyman.
Tonight, a mass shooting at this Louisiana movie theater. Police say 12 people were shot and 3 are confirmed dead, including the shooter, who reportedly died of a self-inflicted gunshot wound.
The movie Trainwreck opened in July of 2015. An adult comedy, the film follows comedian Amy Schumer as she changes her way from good time girl to a one-man girl in a sort of raunchy rom-com. It was the perfect girls' night out movie for lifelong best friends Jillian and Morgan. The pair grew up in Nashville, Tennessee, but both eventually moved to Louisiana, and their friendship was as tight as ever. Meeting up for a dinner and movie, or sometimes just dinner, was a frequent girls' night out activity the friends were used to doing. Sometimes they got so caught up in conversation that they would skip the movie altogether, and the evening of July 23rd, 2015 was very nearly a night where they sat in the restaurant, chatting and catching up. But Morgan and Jillian really wanted to see this movie, so they hurried along, knowing they would be a little late to the film. Sadly, for these two women, even being 10 minutes late wasn't enough to prevent them from walking directly into a dark movie theater that one of them would never walk out of. It should have been a typical Thursday night, consisting of dinner and a movie. Instead, their joyous evening turned into the most traumatic and life-altering event either woman could ever imagine. Active Shooter the podcast is a High Five Holly production, and I'm your host, JT. If you've listened to our prior episodes, you know that the Active Shooter podcast team has taken the No Notoriety pledge, and we will not be sharing the real name of the shooters that we cover. We will be giving the shooters a pseudonym and refer to them by that name throughout the episode. This will help in clearing up any confusion in the story, while remaining true to our pledge and not naming the shooter by their actual name. We will refer to today's shooter as Alan. Thursday, July 23rd, 2015 was a typical day on the surface. At least, it seemed that way for the 2 innocent victims who were murdered inside a movie theater. Same for the 9 others that were injured, some severely, some minorly. None of them will ever be the same, though. The sun will rise and set each day, yet those days will always be a little different for the deceased survivors and loved ones. For each of those who had the misfortune of being at the Grand 16 Theater on July 23rd, were exposed to the kind of evil that we expect only from horror movies or a worse nightmares. The Grand 16 Theater is located at 3141 Johnston Street in Lafayette, Louisiana. The theater bans concealed weapons of any kind, but this didn't deter 59-year-old Allen, who intended to commit a horrific crime. Parking his 1995 Lincoln Continental near the theater's exit, he merely slid his High-Point model JCP 40 caliber handgun into either the waistband or pocket of his khaki shorts. And Allen walked around the front and into the theater. He looked like an average guy, wearing an untucked short-sleeve white polo shirt with his khaki shorts, and he sported white hair on his head and face.
He was like 6-7 seats down from us. He just looked like a common guy, anyone off the streets, just good-looking guy, just normal. And he was in his late 50s, in white hair, white facial hair.
Allen purchased a single ticket to the movie, Trainwreck, almost 10 minutes after the start of the film, which began at 7:10 p.m. Walking into theater number 14 alone, Allen sat in the second-to-last row. Theater 14 contained approximately 25 people, and there were about 100 people in the entire building, which is 100 people too many to have to endure such an event. Armed with his gun and 2 10-round magazines, Allen pulled the firearm from his pants at 7:27 p.m. and opened fire while simultaneously walking down the steps of the theater. It didn't seem that he had a specific target, as Allen wordlessly fired at random into the dark theater. The first 2 shooting victims happened to be sitting almost directly in front of Allen.
He was by himself, he sat by himself, and the first 2 people he shot were sitting right in front of him.
Several moviegoers thought they heard firecrackers, which must have seemed incredibly disorienting. After all, why would fireworks be going off at the start of a movie? As patrons in other theaters watched their films, a voice came on the intercom saying that there was an emergency and everyone needed to evacuate immediately.
Evacuate this building. Please evacuate this building.
Additionally, the fire alarm was pulled to alert patrons of the crisis. Naturally, most people assumed there was a fire and rushed towards the exits.
I think by her pulling the fire alarm, that warned everyone and alerted everyone. Something's happening, evacuate. So yeah, she easily could have saved multiple lives.
It wasn't until they got outside and saw people lying in the grass, bleeding, that the reality of the situation was dawning on them. The words gun, shooter, and gunshots were a part of nearly every other word, which brought the dreadful realization that there was no fire. This was an active shooter situation.
We have an active shooter here. I need units with rifles. Listen, we need everybody over here. Send me anybody you got.
Allen managed to rip off a total of 10 rounds before he exited through a side door where he knew his car was nearby. It seems that when he walked out of the building, that he tried to get to his vehicle by blending in with the other patrons who were fleeing the building. As he was trying to blend in with the crowd, Allen saw police lights and heard sirens, and this spooked him enough that he did an about-face and walked back into the building.
That he'd staged his keys in such a manner that he wouldn't have had to dig them out of his pocket. He could have
the key was on top of the tire.
On top of the tire, that he could have just grabbed them and jumped in the car and taken off.
After re-entering, Allen fired 3 more shots before turning the gun on himself. He put the gun in his mouth, pulled the trigger, and ended the entire senseless, disturbing event. Within several minutes from start to finish, 14 bullets were spent during Allen's rampage, which may not seem large in number, but was utterly devastating in the physical, psychological, and monetary damage that this pointless act caused.
We look over to the left, see where the sound is coming from, and it's the shooter. He's just standing up, just shooting at the whole crowd.
Well, after the first shot, there was about a second or two, and then you could hear the remaining shots begin, 2, 3, 4, 5, pretty quickly So at that point, I looked back to make sure you're hearing the right thing because you want to be sure that's not what it is. And that's when you see the lights coming out of the gun and you understand at that point that this is happening, this is real, this is what it is, and you have to react.
A witness later recalled hearing a woman shout, quote, "He's reloading," before she ran out of the theater. And this very moment alone is enough to leave lifelong emotional scars and PTSD.
911, what are you reporting? There's a shooting at Grade 16. Wait, ma'am, do you have a description of the person with the gun? He was wearing a white polo. I don't know, he's an older man. How many shots you heard?
Like 6 or 7. He shot right at people.
One is shot in the leg. You're shot in the leg, too? The ambulance on the way. 911, what are you reporting?
We're at the Grand Theater on Johnson Street, and we're in the movies, and someone just started shooting people.
The first of many 911 calls was received at 9:28 p.m., and police officers arrived less than 1 minute later.
Units were close by and responded immediately. Our response time was less than a minute. 4 officers entered the theater to engage the shooter. They did hear shots being fired at that time.
The gunman.
Police arrived at a scene of complete chaos outside the theater. They could hear gunshots, and one victim that was shot in the leg was seen with a t-shirt wrapped around it as a tourniquet. After securing aid for the obviously injured victims outside, police made their way into the theater.
We just heard the alarm go off, and then everybody's just screaming to get out. People everywhere, panic. It's all panic.
Only 2.5 minutes after arriving at the theater, the shooter was located. He was dead from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Since Allen was no longer an imminent threat, his body was left inside the theater for several hours while police investigated. The surrounding area was put on lockdown as police searched for additional shooters.
As they made their way into the crowd, they heard a shot, and upon entering the theater, the suspect was found deceased from a self-inflicted gunshot wound.
Numerous agencies responded to the scene, including the Louisiana State Police, the Lafayette Parish Sheriff, the Lafayette Police, the ATF, and the FBI. The investigation showed that Allen was staying at a local Motel 6, and when his hotel room was searched, all sorts of disguises, including wigs and sunglasses, were uncovered. Police thought that these items were kept to disguise himself after the shooting to go on the run. Allen illegally switched out the license plate on his car, but it was discovered in the theater parking lot. Inside the vehicle, 2 separate objects with wires were found, and immediately deemed suspicious. In the early morning hours following that day, July 25th, the bomb squad was called to handle the vehicle's suspicious objects. Nothing was found to be dangerous, although police did come across some more disguises.
We found wigs and glasses and disguises basically in his room.
The Grand 16 cinema was shut down after the shooting, reopening about 4 months later on November 19, 2015. During the shutdown, various personal items were found in the theater, left behind as people fled in the movie theater's total darkness. Items included purses and shoes. Yes, some patrons, frightened to their very core, literally ran out of their shoes. 9 moviegoers were injured in the shooting. Those injuries ranged from minor to critical, and victims aged from late teens to 60s. Some injuries were the result of gunshot wounds, but others came from the scene's madness, as approximately 100 people ran for their lives. 8 victims were rushed to the emergency room by ambulance, and 1 went by private vehicle. Nearly 160 witnesses were interviewed as part of the investigation. It is suspected that Allen went to Louisiana around July 2nd or 3rd, driving around the state along Interstate 10. Police assume Allen was looking for a place to attack, although it's unclear if that was proven or not. During the week of July 13th, he went to the Lake Charles Food Bank twice, begging for financial assistance. It appears that Allen also traveled to numerous different movie theaters around the state, and had visited the Grand 16 Theater at least once before, At one of the theaters he went